in the booth, and we are going to start recording the audiobook of Waking Ursa Minor. Now, I haven't recorded in quite some time, so this may be more of a practice. We're going to go through the prologue today, and yeah, I guess we'll just see how it goes, because I have done a warm-up, I have been thinking about the voices, but it's been a long time since I have seen this material. So yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I'm also recording it for my YouTube channel, which if you haven't checked out my YouTube channel, it's the same handle. You can check out some of my other audiobooks there. They are up there, but they are obviously some bits have been redacted for YouTube, but that's fine. So I may have to mute the mic at some points for TikTok as I carry on this journey. I think we're all right for this chapter, but some of the chapters maybe have to be muted for a little bit. So yeah, I have on my screen the text. I have recording software. It is a new setup. Last time I recorded an audiobook, I was using my tablet, so it was completely soundless scroll. And since then, I have built this booth. It's brand new. Yeah, so we're gonna have to see if the scroll is soundless. I hope so. Otherwise, yeah, I might have to do some rejigging to my setup. But let's give it a go. So we're going to go through the prologue of Waking Ursa Minor. Oh, I need my clicker though, don't I? Which is behind here. Clicker would be useful. I do really need to learn punch and roll. That's the next thing on my list. Again, why this might just be a practice run of the prologue. See how the voices are doing, and then yeah, we'll just take it from there. But I do need to learn punch and roll, because apparently that will make the process go a lot quicker. So here we go with the prologue. Prologue. The lights of the living sky were so bright, squirming in a tumultuous orgy of colour and energy, that they threatened to expose the cloaked figure scurrying down the palm-covered walkway that led to the steps of the palace. The waters of the lake that stretched before the ostentatious building reflected their brilliance with such intensity that the thousands of torches lining the citadel were almost unnecessary. Night had become twilight in their shimmering glow. The sheer physicality of the extra... I'm going to do that again. I didn't like that. Also, I seem to be peaking a lot. My husband has borrowed my mic, so I am wondering if the gain has been slightly altered. So I think I'm going to start this bit again. That seems a bit better. Okay, let's pause that. Delete that section, and we'll start again, because I wasn't happy with that. Prologue. The lights of the living sky were so bright, squirming in a tumultuous orgy of colour and energy, that they threatened to expose the cloaked figure scurrying down the palm-covered walkway that led to the steps of the palace. The waters of the lake that stretched before the ostentatious building reflected their brilliance with such intensity that the thousands of torches lining the citadel were almost unnecessary. Night had become twilight in their shimmering glow. The sheer physicality of the extra ether in the sky weighed down on the man hugging the shadows, constricting his rapid breaths like the muggy heat that came after a jungle rain. It was so thick that the wooden airships used to ferry folk to the floating islands above lurched sickeningly on the coloured clouds. They strained against their tethers, rolling as if on a sea, about to be battered by a storm. The man looked up, the corners of his mouth turned down, his brow furrowed, as yells sounded from the crew of the two vessels. The man looked up, the corners of his mouth The man looked up, the corners of his mouth turned down, his brow furrowed, as yells sounded from the crew of two vessels struggled to keep them from colliding. Why can I not get this line? The man looked up, and the corners of his mouth turned down. The man looked up, the corners of his mouth turned down, his brow furrowed, as yells sounded from the crew of two vessels struggled to keep them from colliding. I think I need to pause there. That is a mistake that I need to make a note of. There's a word missing in my text. Where have I put my piece of paper? It's not there. So I will just have to write that in. This is the thing, at least I'm the author, I can change the words. Work in progress. Why is nothing working? Why is nothing working? Come on, Word. Oh. Right. Okay. And now I've got highlight on, and I don't want highlight on. Thank you very much. Let's try that again, shall we? Not doing very well at all. Okay. How's this for take 3? Prologue. The lights of the living sky were so bright, squirming in a tumultuous orgy of colour and energy, that they threatened to expose the cloaked figure scurrying down the palm-covered walkway that led to the steps of the palace. The waters of the lake that stretched before the ostentatious building reflected their brilliance with such intensity that the thousands of torches lining the citadel were almost unnecessary. Night had become twilight in their shimmering glow. The sheer physicality of the extra ether in the sky weighed down on the man hugging the shadows, constricting his rapid breaths like the muggy heat that came after a jungle rain. It was so thick that the wooden airships used to ferry folk to the floating islands above lurched sickeningly on the coloured clouds. They strained against their tethers, rolling as if on a sea about to be battered by a storm. The man looked up, the corners of his mouth turned down, his brow furrowed, as yells sounded from the crew of two vessels as they struggled to keep them from colliding. The pressure of the magic filling the sky also fueled the crowd that had gathered below. The atmosphere was so tense the air crackled. It wouldn't take much to ignite the spark of riot and revolt, setting die-hard loyalists against those who demanded their freedom from the absolute monarchs who had presided over them for centuries. He only hoped they'd hold out until he'd completed his task. Then, perhaps, some unnecessary bloodshed could be avoided. Rows of drained soldiers separated the man from the masses, yet still he pulled his cloak close around him so they wouldn't notice. Than, Grand Tyke, right hand of the Tyches-to-be himself. He couldn't let anything get in the way of tonight's ceremony. The future of Rygh-Pedersen depended on it. As he neared the base of the steps, he clung to the darkness offered by the thick jungle that surrounded the palace, flinching at every whoop of an ape or cree of a bird. Finally, he spotted the Finally, he spotted the equally heavily cloaked form of the High Warlock making his way towards him furtively, holding a long object swathed in black silk before him as if it were a venomous snake.
"Is he ready?"
Beads of sweat dotted the withered man's top lip, but whether from the heat of the jungle or from nerves, Than couldn't tell. All he knew was his own was just as wet. He drew the back of his hand across his lips and noticed it was shaking.
"He is more than ready. Gods! He killed his own father for this. That's how ready he is."
Than shuddered as he remembered the crazed glee in the eyes of the Itzelid heir when he'd left him moments before.
"The procession will be making its way any minute now."
The ancient man held out the stick-like object in his hands.
"Are you ready?"
Than reached out and pulled back the silk that slithered from the object like a shed skin. There, in the warlock's gnarled hands, lay the sceptre of the Taikes, its slender golden staff glinting in the light from the ether above. Nestled in the gilded cradle was the reason the gaseous magic hung low and heavy in the sky. Drawn to it like a magnet, the stone of Reverda. No, I didn't like that. Nestled in the gilded cradle was the reason the gaseous magic hung Nestled in the gilded cradle was the reason the gaseous magic hung low and heavy in the sky, drawn to it like a magnet, the stone of Reverda. The largest solid embodiment of the veins of magic that ran below and hovered above the surface of Reverda, crafted at the hands of the old gods. The stone that connected and protected all living things was also the means of controlling them. His hands shook as he reached for the staff, nodding with an urgency that frightened him.
"It must be done. He cannot be allowed access to so much power. He's taken enough as it is. He drained a Nifmi, a child of the gods themselves. Look!"
He pointed up at the stars that glinted through the swirling mists. One cluster, a rectangle with a 3-starred tail, stood out from the others, its blue-white sparkle gone, replaced instead by a pulsating red glow.
"He's taken the poor child's life, his powers, and usurped his heavenly sigil. He's all but immortal now."
His voice dipped first into pity and then to despair.
"If he has control of the power lines, of the ether and of fusion, it's only a matter of time before he will drain Reverda herself."
He gripped the scepter in both hands and looked up into the older man's eyes. He tried to swallow down the bilious lump that clogged his throat.
"Are you sure it will work? The Earth magics are so unpredictable."
His voice trailed off as he thought of the possibility of failure. He couldn't even begin to imagine what it would look like other than his own brutal execution, yet it would have dire consequences for every man, woman, child, and beast of the Empire. The warlock licked his lips as he thought how to answer.
"One never knows with Earth magic, but it is the only thing with enough power to possibly counter him."
He turned and motioned to the dais at the top of the steps. A line of figures, all shapes and sizes, creatures and creeds, stood there waiting.
"The warlocks are assembled, our own private guard on hand, and—"
He waved a hand to the floating isle just outside the citadel, supported by its near-solid column of ether that glowed pink against the night sky, a small armada of airships at the ready.
"The Nifmi look down on us from the skies, here and across the whole of Reverda. They will have vengeance for what has been done. Together we will recite the incantation while you harness the power lines to put him down."
The hollowness of dread sank in his chest.
"And if it isn't enough? If it doesn't kill him?"
The old man rolled his shoulders and stood a head taller.
"Then he will be incarcerated in that tomb for the rest of time. Of that I am certain. A mare would have to birth a blue-haired bastard on land before the laws of nature and magic allow him to go free."
A sawn? A horn sounded in the near distance, and the warlock sucked his teeth before throwing off his cloak, and the white of his suddenly exposed robes near blinding Than.
"Come, it is time. Do not let him touch that sceptre, and whatever you do, do not let go. You are the anchor."
Than gulped and removed his own cloak, displaying his ceremonial blue and gold trimmed robes beneath.
"I won't, even if it kills me."
The warlock, who had begun to climb the many worn steps to take his place on the dais, turned and looked at him with narrow eyes.
"It may well do, your lordship."
He said no more, and left the Grand Tyke stewing in his own fear. The horn sounded again, and the, until now, agitated crowd fell silent and divided, making way for the procession of the Itzalid heir. A score of drained guards came first, their eyes vacant, but their weapons sharp, ready for use at a second's notice. Their presence cast a chill over those they passed, forcing those nearest to shiver and shrink in on themselves. Nobody got close to a drained. The ranks swelled with magical creatures of all shapes and sizes, a fury of fur, fangs, scales, and pure muscle. Not fully alive, yet not dead either, they were the creation of the air and his to control. Cross paths with the Tyches-to-be with magic in your blood, and you could very well be joining the ranks. Next came the dancing girls, swirling and gyrating in time with the lutes and drums, brushing off the chill and filling the air instead with the heady scent of seduction, and lastly, a raised sedan chair on which sat the most alarmingly beautiful man ever to have graced Rygh-Pedersen. Slender of body and face, but with an athletic prowess lurking beneath his delicate skin, Narrate-Itzalid's face was split into a wide smile, his stone-coloured eyes glittering with greed over his narrow nose. He tossed his long black hair over his shoulder as the chair reached the bottom of the steps and lowered, allowing him to disembark. Without seeming to move his legs, he glided up the steps. He eyed the warlocks with a lazy glance before turning to look down on his soon-to-be people. Possessions. His pointed tongue slithered past his teeth and caressed his thin lips in anticipation. Than made his way to the base of the steps, the staff gleaming in the ethereal light. Despite the heat of the tropical night, the flesh on his bare arms erupted into chilled pinpricks, the hairs standing on end as the air focused on him. He looked up and caught his eye, his stomach clenching painfully as Narrate sneered. Slowly, not taking his eyes from the staff in the Grand Tyke's hand, the Tyches-to-be lowered himself to sit on the throne at the centre of the stage, ready to claim his birthright. The High Warlock and his companions stepped forwards, The High Warlock and his companions stepped forward, forming a semicircle behind the throne. The old man raised a vial to his lips and drank. Then he began the ceremony, his voice magnified and projecting over the crowd gathered in the citadel and up to the sky above.
"After a loss comes new life. Such is it with a coronation. Tyches Melanius Itzalid's reign was cut short by illness."
He paused, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. The young man on the throne didn't show any sign of grief or sorrow at the mention of his father's untimely passing. He merely looked impatient.
"But such was the will of the gods. We are gathered here today to begin the reign of our new Tyches, Narrate-Itzalid."
Than didn't hear the rest of the words of the coronation ceremony as he mounted the stairs, staring at the man who must be stopped, the man he had led on this path of corruption. He had started this. Now it was time to end it.
Need to pause there.
and have a drink of water.
I don't know how this is going. I seem to be peaking a lot, so I really need to work on my mic, I think. Oh, helps if you open the lid. Yeah, so what am I working on? I am trying to record the prologue for the first chapter of my epic fantasy, Waking Ursa Minor. I actually wrote this, it came out 2 years ago, but I'm only now starting to do the recording of the audiobook. So yes, Waking Ursa Minor is the title, it is epic fantasy, and let's carry on. Whew, warm in here. Okay, let's carry on. Where did I get to? That would help. His feet carried him blindly to the dais. His feet carried him blindly to the dais, as he felt every single eye of the crowd burrowing into his spine. The air was so heavy with ether now, he could almost taste it. He breathed in deeply, hoping some of the vapors would make their way into his bloodstream, calming him, yet also strengthening him. The scepter lay flat across his open palms, ready to be presented to the new ruler of Reverda. He reached the platform as the High Warlock finished speaking, and bent forward, holding the scepter out for his new ruler to gaze upon. The responsibility... My tongue ran away with me there. The scepter lay flat across his open palms, ready to be presented to the new ruler of Reverda. He reached the platform as the High Warlock finished speaking, and bent forward, holding the scepter out for his new ruler to gaze upon the responsibility of the powers that would soon be his. He swallowed painfully as he raised himself from his cautious bow and looked into the eyes of his friend. Nausea washed over him in a sweaty wave, and he licked his lips. Nirat leaned forward conspiratorially. Come on, Fan. This is what we've waited so long for. It's finally time. He winked and ran his tongue over his teeth. Now give me that scepter so we can go and drain some of those delicious-looking dancing girls. The Grand Tyke gave a weak smile and glanced behind the Tykers-to-be at the Warlocks. They nodded in unison, joined hands, and began to chant. He didn't open, he closed. Than closed his open palms and slid his hands apart down the shaft as he pointed it, gem first, at his old friend. The wind began to pick up, swirling around the lights in the sky, pulling them down through a whirlwind funnel into the stone now pointed at the heir's chest. Nirat looked about in confusion. Than, what are you doing? Give me the stone. The Itzalid heir made as if to jump from the throne and snatch it, but found himself bound, the stone chair warping around him, enclosing him as the gemstone began to glow. Dark-robed figures stepped up at his sides, chest straps adorned with tiny glittering vials, ready to throw at the heir to weaken his power, the Warlock's guards. I think I got the whole of that intonation wrong. I told you I haven't been doing this in a while, so this is kind of a practice to get me back into it. I guess, you know, you gotta keep things up. Right. Dark-robed figures stepped up at his sides, chest straps adorned with tiny glittering vials, ready to throw at the heir to weaken his power, the Warlock's guards. Nirat growled, You traitor! You're all traitors!
With his left hand he made a grasping motion, and the nearest guard was swept off his feet and pulled by an invisible force towards the throne. He grasped at the flagstones wildly, trying to slow his trajectory. It was no use. With a flick of his wrist, the Tyches-to-be flung him into the air. As he squeezed the talons of his claw-like hand together, the guard screamed in agony, his body folding in on itself, cracking, smoking, and charring until all that remained was a smouldering ball of carbon that he launched at the other guards. It left a hole in the first one's stomach and knocked a second down the steps. His screams of pain brought a manic smile to Nirat's eyes. "This ends now, Nirat." Than's voice cracked as he held himself steady against the ever-strengthening wind when the scepter began to shake, a bolt of crackling light shooting from its tip. The Tyches screamed with fury and countered the earth magic with as much of his own as he could from his bound hands. They met with a crash so loud that it took Than a moment to realize he was deafened, but noise was not a concern right now. The sheer strength of Nirat's power nearly knocked him off his feet, but he roared and held the scepter steady with his powerful muscles. Sound returned in a boom, the screams of the crowd running for their lives as the whirlwind grew, the clash of weapons as the Drained fought those who realized what was happening and tried to protect Than from their grasp, the strained chanting of the warlocks as they struggled to contain the writhing man who was using all his strength to free himself from their binds. Stinging sweat dripped into his eyes, forcing him to blink away from the ever-ricocheting lines of power that pushed each other back and forth. He was beginning to tire, and the point of impact made its juddering way back towards him. The lights in the sky had disappeared, sucked down into the gemstone, leaving the power battle a blinding source of light in the black night. The staff was shaking wildly, the force of the ether surging through it from above spilled over the gem's cradle and down the golden shaft towards Than's right hand. As it oozed over his flesh, he screamed like he had never screamed before. His hand, a molten orange glow against the night sky, was melting, contorting, infused with so much raw power he thought his heart would stop. His knees buckled under the torment, but he held on to the scepter with all his might. With the help of the constant barrage of potions driving him to foul-mouthed distraction, the effusive stone of the throne had nearly reached the Tyches' face and hands, yet still he fought it. Nirat grinned at his betrayer's pain and shouted at him through gritted teeth. "You are going to regret this, traitor. Even if you lock me away in this tomb, I swear on the stone of Rygh-Pedersen itself that I will be back. And I will be there to kill you once and for all." His voice came out in pants as white-hot pain shot through Than's entire body. He forced himself to his feet once more and pulled on his own power source, the power he'd stolen from others, just as his opponent had. Let their lives not have been in vain if he could use their essence now to finish this. As he expelled the magic in a blast that sent air bursting through the surrounding whirlwind, the stone in the cradle glowed with such intensity that without thinking, he removed his left hand from the staff to cover his eyes. In a last-ditch attempt to stop the stone from closing around him, Nirat threw a bolt of power from his vanishing hand. It hit the crystal side on. The crack that sounded shook the earth down to its core, knocking all present off their feet. The staff was flung from Than's hands down the steps, half of the gemstone flying off into the toppling undergrowth and landed with a splash in the bubbling waters of the lake. The ether whirlwind sucked itself back up into the sky, taking anything in its path along with it, leaves, branches, flagstones, even entire trees, their roots ripped from the moist jungle soil. One of the airships had broken its tether and came hurtling towards the platform. He ducked with an explosion of curses, certain his end had come. He ducked with an explosion of curses, certain his end had come, but the creaking hull missed him by inches. The smallest of gasps was ripped from him as a stray rope from the ship wound its way around his ankle. He looked around wildly for something to hold on to, but in vain. As the vessel and its screaming crew were sucked upwards on the wind, he was dragged up into the air, spinning and turning with the spiral of disappearing power just as the platform he had been standing on collapsed and the sealed throne fell through the earth, the palace collapsing on top of it. Spinning around wildly in the vortex, Than watched in the dying light as the lake frothed and churned, the shores splitting, chasms swallowing the jungle as earth was ripped asunder. Chasms swallowing the jungle as the earth was ripped asunder. The courtyard of the citadel erupted into splintered shards of rock, throwing people high into the air, slamming them into rock faces or skewering them on spires. Others disappeared, sliding down the smooth marble into the churning earth below, swallowed up before they could even cry out for help. The groan of tumbling buildings drowned out the screams of those they crushed as the great palace of the warlocks fell to its knees in a plume of choking dust. The dying world screamed in an ear-splitting howl as the column of ether light supporting the skyle flickered once, twice, and then went out altogether. There was a split second of stillness before the landmass and all who dwelt there were sent hurtling to the ground, their screams of terror lost in the pandemonium, whilst Than was swept away into the black nothing of an etherless sky. Oh, goodness me. I'm going to open the door because it's quite warm. There we go. Glimpse into the real world outside the booth. How do I feel that went? I'm not sure. There's a lot of peaking just from like normal volume. So I think I do need to play around with my mic a bit because, yeah, I don't want all these peaks and stuff. But I will listen back. I don't think I can do anymore because it's actually started raining. And if it's anything like the rain we had at 5 o'clock this morning, you will be able to hear that on the recording because it was a lot. Definitely a lot. Please let me know what you think if you enjoyed that. If you didn't, I'm going to end the recording now